I took the job because I needed something simple. That's the truth of it, and I think it matters to say that up front, because everything that came after was shaped by the fact that I wasn't looking for anything unusual. I wasn't the kind of person who chased mysteries or got restless in quiet places. I'd spent 2 years driving for a logistics company out of Long Beach, and before that I worked the floor at a warehouse in Fontana, and when my knees started giving me trouble on the concrete, I figured I'd find something that let me sit down for most of the night. Security work pays reasonably if you're willing to take the overnight shift, and I was willing. The building was called Meridian Tower. You've probably seen it if you've driven through downtown on the 110. It's one of those newer high-rises, all glass and brushed steel, the kind of building that looks like it was designed to photograph well from a distance. 80-some floors. During the day it was full of law firms and consulting groups and the West Coast offices of companies headquartered in New York or London. At night it was mine. Mine and 2 other guards, technically, though we each had our own sections and rarely crossed paths except at shift change. The interview was brief. The HR coordinator was a woman named Deborah, who worked out of a shared office on the 3rd floor and seemed mildly annoyed by the entire process. She told me the schedule was 4 nights on, 3 nights off, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. She told me the uniform would be provided and that I'd need to supply my own black shoes with non-marking soles. She told me that most of the job was monitoring camera feeds from the security office on the 2nd floor, with hourly patrols of my assigned section, and that I'd be responsible for logging any irregularities in the building management system. She asked if I had any questions. I asked about parking. She said the garage was included. Training lasted 3 nights. My supervisor was a man named Gil Parada, who had been working at Meridian for 6 years and had the calm, slightly detached demeanor of someone who had long ago made peace with the monotony of the job. Gil was maybe 55, stocky, with reading glasses he kept on a lanyard around his neck. He showed me the security office first, a room about the size of a studio apartment, windowless, with a long desk facing a bank of 12 monitors. Each monitor cycled through 4 camera feeds on a timed rotation, which meant you were looking at 48 different views of the building every few minutes. Hallways, stairwells, loading docks, the lobby, the parking garage. Most of them showed nothing. Empty corridors under fluorescent light. Identical doors receding into identical distance. It looked like the same image copied across every screen, though of course it wasn't. Gil walked me through the logging software, which was a proprietary system called Condor, that tracked everything from badge swipes to HVAC alerts. He showed me how to file an incident report, how to flag a maintenance issue, how to annotate a camera timestamp if I noticed something worth noting. He explained the patrol routes, which were mapped out on laminated sheets kept in a binder on the desk. My section covered floors 15 through 40, plus the parking levels B1 through B3. The patrols were straightforward. Take the elevator to the top of your section, walk the perimeter of each floor checking that suite doors were locked and emergency exits were sealed, then ride back down to the next floor and repeat. It took about 45 minutes if you didn't rush. Gil said there was no reason to rush. On the 2nd night of training, Gil took me through some of the building's quirks. Every building has them, he said. Meridian had a freight elevator on the east side that sometimes skipped floor 22 if you didn't hold the button firmly. It had a stairwell door on 31 that didn't latch properly and would drift open on its own, which triggered a sensor alert roughly twice a week. It had a section of the parking garage on B2 where the camera had a dead zone behind a structural column, and Gil said to make sure I walked that area during my garage checks because the camera couldn't cover it. These were the kinds of things I expected. Practical details. The texture of a job that someone had been doing long enough to know its small, specific imperfections. It was near the end of that second night, maybe 5 in the morning, when Gil mentioned floor 77. We were back in the security office, and he was going over the patrol log from the previous shift as a way of showing me how entries should look. He had his glasses on and was scrolling through lines of text on the screen, and without looking up he said, "Oh, and you don't need to check floor 77. I waited for him to continue, but he just kept scrolling. After a moment I said, "Okay. It's not part of the patrol route," he said. "It's not in your section anyway, but even if something flags up there, just leave it. Someone else handles that." Someone else on the security team. Building management. It's a restricted floor. You won't have badge access and the elevator won't take you there, so it's mostly a non-issue. I just mention it so you're not confused if you see it come up somewhere. That was the entirety of the conversation. Gil moved on to explaining how the shift change handoff worked, and I didn't think about floor 77 again for several weeks. There was nothing strange about it in context. Large commercial buildings often have restricted floors, mechanical levels, server rooms, floors leased to tenants with specific security requirements, government contractors, financial firms, that kind of thing. I assumed floor 77 was something along those lines. A floor managed by the tenant rather than by building security. It didn't interest me. I was thinking about the patrol routes and the logging software and whether I'd be able to stay awake through the dead hours between 3 and 5 a.m. My first solo shift was on a Wednesday. I remember because Wednesdays were the quietest nights according to Gil, and he thought it would be a good one to start on. He was right. Almost nothing happened. I sat in the security office and watched the monitors cycle through their feeds. I filled out the shift start checklist. I did my first patrol at midnight, riding the elevator to 40 and working my way down, checking doors, scanning my badge at the checkpoints mounted on the wall at each floor's elevator lobby. The checkpoints were part of the tracking system. They logged that you'd physically been on that floor at that time, which fed into the patrol record in Condor. Everything was locked. Everything was quiet. The floors had that particular stillness that office buildings get at night, a kind of held breath quality, as though the air itself had stopped circulating. The lights were on their overnight setting, which meant every other bank of fluorescence was off. So the hallways had a dim, alternating pattern of lit and shadowed sections. My footsteps were the only sound. I want to describe the experience of those first few weeks accurately, because the tendency when telling a story like this is to skip past the ordinary parts and get to whatever comes later. But the ordinary parts are important. They're the foundation. The job was overwhelmingly boring, not unpleasantly so. I have a reasonable tolerance for boredom, which is probably why I lasted as long as I did, but boring in a way that becomes its own kind of environment. You sit in a room and you watch screens that show you nothing. You walk through hallways where nothing has changed since the last time you walked through them. You fill out logs that say "no irregularities observed" over and over again in slightly different phrasing because you feel strange writing the exact same thing every hour. You drink coffee from the machine in the second-floor break room, which produces a thin, slightly burnt liquid that you learn to appreciate not for its flavor but for its warmth and its caffeine. You listen to the building. You become familiar with its sounds, the hum of the HVAC system, the occasional click of a relay somewhere in the walls, the faint whistle of wind against the upper floors when the Santa Anas were blowing. You develop a sense for what the building sounds like when it's functioning normally, which is most of the time. I settled into the job quickly. I liked the solitude. I liked having a task that was clearly defined and didn't require me to make complex decisions. Check the cameras, walk the floors, log what you see. The building was my responsibility between 11 and 7, and as long as nothing went wrong, all I had to do was be present and attentive. It suited me. It was probably around my 3rd week that I noticed the first thing I couldn't quite explain. I was in the security office doing a routine scan of the camera feeds. This was something you did every 15 or 20 minutes. Sit down, look at each monitor, make sure nothing was obviously wrong. Motion on a floor that should be empty, a door propped open, water on the floor from a leak, that kind of thing. It was almost never anything. But you looked, because that was the job. On monitor 6, which covered a section of the upper floors, one of the rotating feeds showed a hallway I didn't recognize. That in itself wasn't alarming. There were floors above my patrol section that I'd never visited, and I assumed the camera feeds included them. But this particular hallway looked different from the others. The carpet was a darker color. The lighting was warmer, more amber than the standard cool white, and the corridors seemed longer than what I was used to seeing, stretching back farther than the camera's usual field of view, as though the lens had a wider angle or the hallway itself was simply deeper. The feed was on screen for maybe 5 seconds before the rotation cycled to the next camera, which showed a perfectly normal stairwell on 34. I watched monitor 6 through another full rotation. When it came back to that slot in the cycle, the feed showed a standard corridor on one of the upper floors. The same gray carpet, the same cool fluorescent light, the same row of identical doors. Whatever I'd seen before was gone. I made a note of it mentally, but didn't log it. Camera feeds sometimes glitch. They pull from the wrong input for a frame or two. The system was old enough, or at least the software managing the feeds was old enough, that minor display errors weren't uncommon. Gil had mentioned that the monitors occasionally showed a feed from the wrong camera, particularly when the system was cycling quickly. It was a known issue. IT had been asked to look at it and hadn't gotten around to it. I forgot about it for a few days. Then it happened again. This time it was on monitor 3, which covered the lobby and lower floors. One of the rotating feeds briefly showed what appeared to be an office space, but not one that matched any layout I'd seen during patrols. The desks were arranged differently. The walls were a pale green instead of the standard off-white. There was a clock on the wall, which struck me as odd, because I'd never seen a wall clock in any of the suites. Everyone used their phones or computers. The image lasted 3 or 4 seconds, then the feed moved on. Again, I didn't log it, but I started paying closer attention to the monitors. Over the next week, I saw the unfamiliar feed 3 more times, always briefly, always on different monitors. The hallway with the dark carpet, the office with the green walls, once what looked like a conference room with a long wooden table and chairs pushed in neatly, the kind of room that could have existed anywhere, but that I was fairly certain didn't exist on any floor I'd patrolled. Each time, the image was clear and stable. It didn't look like a glitch. It looked like a real camera feed from a real location within the building. It just wasn't a location I could identify. I mentioned it to Gil during a shift change. I tried to be casual about it. I said, "Hey, I've been seeing some feeds on the monitors that don't match any floors I know. Looks like maybe a camera from somewhere above 40. Is that normal?" Gil was putting on his jacket. He didn't look concerned. "Yeah, the system pulls from the full camera network sometimes. There are feeds from the upper floors that aren't part of your patrol. You can ignore them. They look different, though. The carpet color, the lighting, doesn't match the rest of the building. Some of the premium floors have custom finishes. The tenants pay for their own build-outs. You'd be surprised how different they look." He zipped his jacket. "Anything else?" "No, that's it." He left, and I felt slightly foolish for having brought it up. Of course, the upper floors looked different. Expensive tenants didn't want the same generic office layout as everyone else. That explained the carpet, the wall color, even the clock. I filed it away as resolved and moved on. But it wasn't quite resolved, because the next night, I decided to check something. During my patrol, instead of taking the elevator to 40 and working down as usual, I rode up past my section to see what the elevator panel showed for the upper floors. This wasn't against any rules. The elevator simply wouldn't open on floors I didn't have access to, so there was no risk of me ending up somewhere I shouldn't be. I just wanted to see the panel. The elevator in Meridian Tower was a standard commercial setup. Buttons for each floor arranged in columns. Lobby, mezzanine, floors 1 through 82, plus the rooftop mechanical level. I'd ridden it dozens of times and never looked closely at the panel beyond pressing the buttons I needed. Now I looked. The numbers were sequential, as you'd expect. Nothing missing, nothing out of order. Floor 77 was listed right there between 76 and 78, like any other floor. Its button was the same as all the others. No special cover, no keyhole, no indicator that it was different. I pressed it. Nothing happened. The elevator didn't move, didn't acknowledge the input. I pressed it again. Same result. The button for 77 simply didn't respond. This was consistent with what Gil had told me. I didn't have badge access. The system wouldn't take me there. The button was inactive for my credential level. Fine. I pressed 76, which lit up, and the elevator rose. I checked the hallway. Standard upper floor layout, slightly quieter than the lower levels. Carpet a shade darker than the mid-building floors, but within the normal range. I rode back down and continued my patrol. That should have been the end of it, and in a way, it was for a while. I went back to my routine. Cameras, patrols, logs, nights passed. I got better at staying awake through the difficult hours. I brought a book to read during the stretches between patrols, something Gil said was fine as long as I kept an eye on the monitors. I developed small rituals, a cup of coffee at midnight, another at 3, a walk around the lobby at 4:30 just to stretch my legs and look at the city through the glass walls. Downtown LA at night is a strange landscape. The buildings are lit but empty. The streets are mostly deserted except for the occasional car or the distant figures of people you can't quite see clearly. It's a city that feels like a model of itself at that hour. Everything is present, but nothing is in use. It was during one of those lobby walks, maybe 5 weeks into the job, that I noticed something in the Condor system that gave me pause. I'd gone back to the security office after my 4:30 walk and was scrolling through the night's log to make sure everything was in order before the end of my shift. The log is a running record of all system activity: badge swipes, elevator movements, camera alerts, sensor triggers, patrol checkpoints, the works. It's mostly automated, with fields for manual entries where the guard on duty adds notes. I was scanning through it quickly, the way you do when you've seen 100 identical logs and you're just confirming that nothing stands out. I saw an entry timestamped at 2:47 a.m. It was a patrol checkpoint log. It read, Checkpoint 77A, Guard ID 4187, 24714. Guard ID 4187 was mine. I looked at it for a long time. I checked the timestamp. At 2:47 a.m., I had been in the security office. I knew this because my second patrol didn't start until 3, and between 1:30 and 3, I'd been sitting at the desk, watching the monitors and reading my book. I hadn't been on floor 77 or any floor at 2:47. I hadn't been on floor 77 ever. There was no checkpoint 77A on my patrol route. There was no checkpoint 77A in the system at all, as far as I knew. I scrolled backward through the log to see if there were other entries I'd missed. There weren't, just the one. A single line indicating that I had scanned my badge at a checkpoint on a floor I'd never visited, at a time when I was sitting in a chair 2 floors below the lobby. I thought about logging it as a system error. That's what it had to be. A database glitch, a crossed entry from another guard's ID, a timestamp error. The Condor system was functional, but not infallible. Gil had mentioned that it sometimes generated phantom entries, particularly when the building management company pushed software updates overnight, which apparently happened without warning. That seemed like the most likely explanation: a phantom entry, a ghost in the machine, if you wanted to be dramatic about it, which I didn't. I deleted the entry. The system allowed guards to remove entries flagged as errors, as long as you logged the deletion with a reason code. I selected System Error/Duplicate Entry from the drop-down menu and confirmed. The line disappeared from the log. I finished my shift, handed off to the day team, and drove home. For the next few days, I checked the logs more carefully. No more phantom entries appeared. The camera feeds continued to occasionally show unfamiliar hallways, but I'd trained myself to ignore them. The building functioned normally. My patrols were uneventful. I was sleeping well during the day, eating regular meals, feeling settled in the job. Whatever small oddities existed in Meridian's systems, they were just that, oddities. Every workplace has them. Then, about 2 months in, the elevator did something I wasn't expecting. I was heading up for my midnight patrol. I stepped in, scanned my badge, and pressed 40. The elevator began to rise. I watched the floor indicator above the door count upward, 15, 16, 17, and then it skipped. It went from 39 to 41. Not quickly, not as a flicker. The display showed 39, paused for the normal interval, and then showed 41. The elevator continued upward for a moment before I realized it had passed my floor. I pressed 40 again. The elevator slowed, stopped, and the doors opened on 42. I stepped out, oriented myself, and took the stairs down 2 flights to 40. Nothing about floor 40 was unusual when I got there. I did my patrol, checked the doors, scanned the checkpoints, everything normal. When I got back to the elevator to go down to 39, I pressed the button and watched the indicator carefully. It behaved normally, 39 was right there between 38 and 40, no skipping, no hesitation. I logged it as an elevator malfunction, display error, floor indicator skipped from 39 to 41, overshot destination floor by 2. Maintenance would see it in the morning and either fix it or add it to their list. It was a mechanical issue. Buildings have them. Except that when I reviewed the Condor log at the end of my shift, the elevator's automated record showed that it had stopped at 40, as requested. According to the system, the elevator had traveled from the lobby to 40 with no anomalies. There was no record of it stopping at 42. There was no record of the display error. The elevator's own data said it had done exactly what I'd asked it to do. I sat with that for a minute. Then I added a manual note to the log describing what I'd experienced. I figured the elevator's self-reporting might not capture display errors. Maybe the display was a separate system from the motor control, and a glitch in one didn't register in the other. That seemed plausible enough. But something about it stayed with me. Not the malfunction itself. Elevator's glitch, that's not remarkable. What stayed with me was the discrepancy between what I had experienced and what the system had recorded. I had been in the elevator. I had seen the display skip. I had exited on 42 and walked down 2 flights of stairs, which took time and effort and was not something I could have imagined. But the building's record said none of that had happened. According to Condor, I had ridden the elevator to 40 and begun my patrol from there, exactly as planned. It was a small thing, a minor inconsistency between a person's experience and a database entry, but it introduced a feeling I hadn't had before in that building, a faint awareness that the systems I relied on to document reality might not be documenting the same reality I was living in. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I'm aware that the natural trajectory of a story like this is toward paranoia, toward the narrator seeing patterns that aren't there, toward a spiral of suspicion that turns mundane events into evidence of something sinister. That's not what happened. Or at least, that's not how it felt while it was happening. I wasn't frightened. I wasn't obsessing. I was doing my job, and occasionally my job produced data that didn't match my observations. That's an annoyance, not a horror. I treated it as such. The weeks continued. I did my patrols. I watched the monitors. I logged my observations. The camera feeds still occasionally showed unfamiliar spaces, and I still ignored them. The elevator behaved normally. The Condor system generated clean logs with no phantom entries. I started to think the earlier oddities had been a fluke, or that they'd been caused by a software issue that had since been patched. The building was quiet and predictable, and I was comfortable in it. Then, on a night in late October, I remember because the lobby had decorative gourds in the planters, which the day staff had apparently put there, I was reviewing camera feeds and noticed something on Monitor 9. Monitor 9 covered a range of upper floors, 50 through 60-something, all well above my patrol section. One of the rotating feeds showed a hallway, and in the hallway there was a person. This got my attention immediately. It was 1:30 in the morning. No one should have been on any floor at that hour, unless they were security or emergency maintenance. The person was walking away from the camera, moving down the center of the corridor at a normal pace. They were wearing dark clothing. It was hard to make out details because the camera was at a distance and the overnight lighting was dim. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. They walked to the end of the hallway, turned a corner, and disappeared from the frame. I watched the feeds cycle through, waiting for the next camera in that hallway to pick them up. It didn't. The next feed showed the corridor from a different angle, and it was empty. I waited for another full rotation. Every feed on that floor showed empty hallways. This was the kind of thing I was supposed to report. An unauthorized person on a floor after hours was a legitimate security concern. I pulled up the floor plan in Condor to identify which floor the camera was on, so I could include the location in my report. The feed was labeled CAM-UF-09, which I assumed meant upper floor, camera 9. But when I searched the camera directory in the system to find its associated floor number, CAM-UF-09 didn't appear. The directory listed cameras by floor and position. For example, CAM-34-East-01 was the first camera on the east corridor of floor 34. There was no UF designation in the directory at all. I searched the full camera list. The UF cameras weren't there. I checked the monitor configuration, which showed which camera feeds were assigned to which monitors. Monitor 9 was supposed to display feeds from floors 50 through 58, all with standard designations. CAM-UF-09 wasn't in the configuration. It wasn't assigned to Monitor 9 or any other monitor. Yet I had just watched it clearly on Monitor 9. I thought about calling Gil. It was the middle of the night, and he wasn't on shift, but we had each other's numbers for emergencies. An unauthorized person in the building could qualify. But I wasn't sure I'd actually seen an unauthorized person. I'd seen a figure on a camera feed that the system said didn't exist, on a floor I couldn't identify, and the figure had appeared for less than 10 seconds before vanishing. If I called Gil and told him that, he'd either think I was overreacting or that I'd dozed off and seen something in a half-dream. Neither option was appealing. I filed a report noting that I'd observed what appeared to be a person on an upper-floor camera feed at approximately 1:30 a.m. I described the feed as unlabeled, possibly mislabeled, and noted that I was unable to identify the specific floor. I recommended that the camera system be reviewed for configuration errors. It was a measured, professional report. It said what I'd seen without saying what I thought it meant, because I didn't know what I thought it meant. No one followed up on the report. I checked the log the next night and the night after. No response, no maintenance ticket, no acknowledgement. Reports in Condor had a status field: open, in review, closed, resolved. Mine stayed on open for a few days. Then I noticed it had been changed to resolved with no notes. Someone had closed it without comment. I considered bringing it up with Gil in person, but the next time I saw him he was in a hurry, dealing with some issue involving a tenant's after-hours delivery that had been scheduled for the wrong entrance. He barely looked at me. I let it go. Around this time, I started keeping a small personal log. Not an official one, just a pocket notebook where I jotted down things I noticed that seemed off. I didn't do this out of suspicion, or because I thought something nefarious was happening. I did it because I was a security guard whose job was to observe, and I was observing discrepancies that the building's systems weren't capturing reliably. It seemed prudent to have my own record. If something ever did go wrong, a break-in, a liability issue, anything, I wanted to be able to say what I'd actually seen, not just what Condor said I'd seen. The notebook entries from that period are mundane mostly, things like November 3rd, 2:15 a.m. Monitor 4 showed unfamiliar hallway, dark carpet, approximately 5 seconds. Camera label illegible. Or, November 7th, 12:50 a.m. Elevator display flickered between 38 and 40 while ascending. Did not stop. Or, 11/10, 4 a.m. Condor log shows patrol checkpoint scan on floor 36 at 3:22 a.m. I was on floor 29 at 3:22 a.m. Deleted entry, logged as system error. That last one bothered me more than the others, not because of the misattributed checkpoint. I'd seen phantom entries before, and I knew how to handle them. What bothered me was the frequency. In my first month, there had been one phantom entry. In my second month, none. In my third month, there were 4. All of them attributed to my guard ID. All of them placing me on floors I hadn't visited, at times I could account for. 3 of them referenced floors within my normal patrol range, which made them easy to dismiss as timestamp errors or duplicated scans. But the 4th, on November 14th, placed me at checkpoint 77B at 3:08 a.m. There it was again, floor 77. I deleted it, same as before. System error, duplicate entry. But this time I also wrote it down in my notebook with the exact timestamp and checkpoint label, 77B. The first phantom entry weeks ago had been 77A. Now there was a 77B. If these were random database errors, they were oddly specific errors, not just referencing the same non-existent floor, but referencing different checkpoints on that floor, as though there were multiple scanning stations up there, as though someone had installed the same infrastructure that existed on every other floor I patrolled. I started paying more attention to floor 77 in the building's systems, not actively investigating. I didn't do anything that could be construed as exceeding my role. I just noticed things. For instance, the building directory in the lobby listed tenants by floor. I'd walked past it 100 times without reading it carefully. One night I stopped and went through it floor by floor. Floors 1 through 76 each had at least one tenant listed. Floor 78 had a tenant listed. 79, 80, 81, 82 all had tenants. Floor 77 was not listed as vacant, not listed as restricted, not listed at all. The directory went from 76 to 78 as though 77 didn't exist. But it did exist. The elevator had a button for it. The Condor system had checkpoint entries for it. Camera feeds occasionally showed hallways that didn't belong to any identified floor. When you added it up, floor 77 was simultaneously absent from every official record and present in every operational system. It was like a tooth that had been extracted from a smile but was still rooted in the jaw. I need to pause here and acknowledge something. A reasonable person hearing all of this would say, talk to your supervisor, talk to building management. Ask a direct question and get a direct answer. And that reasonable person would be right. That's what you should do when your workplace has an unexplained anomaly. But there are reasons I didn't, and they had less to do with fear than with the particular social dynamics of being a night security guard. You have to understand that in this job, you are low on the hierarchy. You are not building management. You are not the property owner. You are not the engineering team or the IT department. You are a contractor employed by a security company that has a contract with the building management company that is itself employed by the ownership group. You are 3 layers removed from anyone who makes decisions. Your job is to watch, walk, and log. When you raise issues, they go into a system and are addressed by people above you, in their own time, according to their own priorities. You are not encouraged to be curious. You are encouraged to be consistent. When Gil told me not to check floor 77, he said it the same way he told me about the door on 31 that didn't latch, as a practical detail, a known condition, something to be aware of and work around. The message, implicit but clear, was that floor 77 was handled by someone else and was not my concern. Pushing further would have marked me as the new guy who didn't understand boundaries, who made problems instead of monitoring them. In a job with a lot of turnover, the people who lasted were the ones who learned the building's rhythms and settled into them. I wanted to last, so I didn't ask. I kept my notebook. I deleted the phantom entries. I ignored the camera feeds. And for a few more weeks, that was enough. December came. The building had a small Christmas tree in the lobby, and the HVAC system was working harder to compensate for the temperature differential between the heated interior and the cold. Well, cold for Los Angeles, which meant low 50s, outside air. My patrols were the same. The building was the same. The notebook had a few more entries, but nothing dramatic. I was sleeping well. I was settled. On December 9th, a Tuesday, I was doing my 1 a.m. patrol. I'd finished the upper floors and was working my way down through the 20s. Floor 23. I stepped off the elevator, scanned the checkpoint, and started walking the perimeter. It was a standard floor. A mid-sized law firm occupied the whole thing, with a reception area near the elevators and corridors branching off to offices and conference rooms. Everything was locked and dark. I walked the east corridor, checking doors. I turned the corner to the south corridor, and I stopped. The carpet was wrong. It was dark, a deep charcoal, almost black, instead of the standard gray. The lighting was different too, warmer. The color temperature had shifted from the cool overhead fluorescence to something more amber, more like incandescent light, though it was still coming from the ceiling fixtures. The hallway stretched ahead of me, longer than it should have been. Floor 23's south corridor had 6 office doors before it dead-ended at a window overlooking the city. I could see 7 doors, maybe 8, and no window at the end. The corridor just continued, diminishing into a point that I couldn't quite resolve. I stood there. I didn't move forward and I didn't step back. I just stood and looked at it. The air was different, not colder or warmer, but thicker, somehow, denser, as though the atmosphere in that hallway had a slightly different composition than the air I'd just been breathing in the elevator lobby. There was no sound, no HVAC hum, no building noise, just an absence of sound that I became acutely aware of because it was so unlike the constant low-grade ambient noise I'd been living in for months. I looked behind me. The east corridor was normal. Standard carpet, standard lighting, standard dimensions. I looked forward again. The south corridor was still wrong, still long, still dark, still silent. I took a step back, then another. I retreated around the corner until I was back in the elevator lobby, where everything looked exactly as it should. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, breathing. Then I walked back to the corner and looked down the south corridor again. It was normal. Gray carpet, cool lighting, 6 doors, a window at the end showing the dark city, and a few lit windows in the building across the street. Everything was as it had always been. I walked the corridor, checked each door, locked, reached the window, and turned back. Normal. Completely, unremarkably normal. I finished my patrol. I went back to the security office. I sat down and I looked at my hands. They were steady. My pulse was slightly elevated, but not racing. I felt alert, not panicked. I opened my notebook and wrote down what I'd seen as precisely as I could. I included the time, 1:14 a.m., and the location, floor 23, South Corridor, and the details. Dark carpet, amber lighting, extended corridor length, absence of terminal window, silence. Then I added a note at the bottom. Duration of observation, approximately 15 seconds. Upon second viewing, corridor appeared normal. Possible explanation: fatigue, visual adaptation after elevator lighting, expectation error. Those were reasonable explanations. The human visual system does strange things when you move between different lighting conditions, especially at night, especially when you're tired. I'd been working night shifts for 3 months, and while I'd adjusted well, sleep disruption has cumulative effects that you don't always notice. A momentary visual distortion in a dim hallway was concerning, but not inexplicable. I'd monitor it. If it happened again, I'd see a doctor. That was the responsible approach. It didn't happen again. Not exactly. What happened instead was subtler and, in retrospect, more unsettling precisely because of its subtlety. Over the next 2 weeks, I began to notice that my personal recollection of my patrols didn't always align with the records I was generating. Not in dramatic ways, not in ways that involved dark carpets or extended hallways, in small ways. For instance, I would complete a patrol and return to the security office, and when I reviewed the checkpoint log, the timestamps would be slightly different from what I expected. I'd think I'd scanned the checkpoint on floor 32 at 1:25, but the log would say 1:31. 6 minutes of discrepancy. Not alarming on its own. I wasn't checking my watch at every checkpoint, so my sense of timing was approximate. But the discrepancies were consistent, and they always went in the same direction. The logs showed me arriving at checkpoints later than I thought I had. I started timing myself more carefully. I'd check my watch when I scanned a checkpoint, and then compare it to the log entry. For a few nights, everything matched. Then, on December 18th, I scanned the checkpoint on floor 28 at 1:42 a.m. I looked at my watch as I did it, specifically to note the time, and the log recorded the scan at 1:51 a.m. 9 minutes later. I was certain of my watch time. I checked my phone to confirm. 1:42. The log said 1:51. I could explain a database timestamp error. I could explain a glitch in the checkpoint hardware. What I couldn't explain was where the 9 minutes had gone, because I'd gone directly from floor 28 to floor 27, and when I scanned the checkpoint on 27, the log said 1:53, 2 minutes after the 28 entry. That meant, according to the system, I'd taken 2 minutes to get from 28 to 27, which was about right. But according to my watch, I'd taken 11 minutes because I'd scanned 28 at 1:42 and 27 at 1:53. 11 minutes to walk 1 flight of stairs and scan a badge. I didn't remember anything unusual about that walk. I remembered leaving the 28th floor lobby, entering the stairwell, descending 1 flight, exiting onto 27, and scanning the checkpoint. It was the same walk I'd done dozens of times. It should have taken 2 minutes, 3 at most. But my watch and my phone both said it had taken 11. I sat in the stairwell between 27 and 26 and tried to think clearly. Either my watch and phone were wrong, both of them, simultaneously by the same amount, or the building system was wrong, or I had lost 9 minutes between 2 floors without being aware of it. That last possibility was the one that frightened me. Not because I thought something supernatural had happened, but because losing time is a medical symptom. Seizures can cause lost time. So can certain types of dissociative episodes. So can extreme fatigue. I'd been working nights for 3 months, and while I felt fine, feeling fine doesn't rule out neurological events that you're not aware of while they're happening. I made a mental note to schedule a doctor's appointment. Then I finished my patrol. Now, I didn't mention the time discrepancy to Gil or anyone else. I didn't want to raise concerns about my fitness for the job. But I started paying very close attention to timestamps from that point forward, and I kept a parallel record in my notebook. The time on my watch when I scanned each checkpoint next to the time the system recorded. For the next 4 nights, everything matched. The discrepancies stopped. My patrols were clean, my logs were accurate, my watch and the system agreed. I began to relax. Whatever had happened on the 18th, it appeared to be isolated. I'd still see the doctor, but I wasn't in a state of active concern. On December 23rd, Christmas Eve, I arrived for my shift and went through the normal startup routine. Badge in, system check, review the handoff notes from the evening guard. The notes were brief. Quiet shift, no issues. Holiday schedule in effect. Reduced tenant occupancy. I settled into the security office, poured my coffee, and started watching the monitors. At midnight, I pulled up the Condor log to review it before my first patrol, and I saw something that made me set down my coffee and leaned forward. There were patrol entries already logged for my shift. Checkpoint scans, time-stamped starting at 11:15 p.m., running through to 11:58 p.m. Floors 15 through 40, every checkpoint in sequence. Guard ID 4187, my ID. I had arrived at 10:55 p.m. I had been in the security office since 11 p.m. I had not done a patrol. It was midnight, and I was about to start my first patrol. But according to Condor, I had already completed one. Every checkpoint, every floor, every scan, all attributed to my badge, all within the past hour, all while I had been sitting in this chair, drinking coffee. I scrolled through the entries slowly. They were formatted identically to my real patrol logs. The timestamps were evenly spaced, consistent with the pace of a normal patrol. Floor 40 at 11:15, 39 at 11:18, 38 at 11:21, and so on, all the way down to 15 at 11:58. It looked exactly like a real patrol conducted by a real person walking real floors. But I hadn't done it. I sat back in my chair and looked at the monitors. The building was quiet. The hallways were empty. Everything on the screens was exactly as it should be. I looked at the log entries again. They were still there. 40 checkpoints, 40 scans, all bearing my name and ID number, all from the past hour, all fictional. For the first time, I felt something that I would describe as genuine unease. Not fear, not yet, but the kind of discomfort that comes from realizing that a system you depend on is not merely glitching, but is producing coherent, structured, false information. Random errors are one thing. A complete fabricated patrol is something else. A random error is noise. A fabricated patrol is a narrative. I didn't delete the entries. Instead, I pulled up the camera archive for the past hour. If someone had actually walked my patrol route, the cameras would have captured them. I fast-forwarded through the feeds for floors 15 through 40, starting at 11:15 p.m. Nothing. Every hallway was empty. No movement on any floor. The cameras confirmed what I knew. No one had walked those floors in the past hour. So the checkpoints had logged scans that didn't happen. 40 of them in sequence, bearing my credentials. I wrote it all down in my notebook. I wrote the time I'd discovered it, the range of the false entries, the fact that camera review showed no corresponding activity. I considered calling Gil. I considered calling the security company directly. But it was midnight on December 23rd, and I knew that whoever I called would either not answer or would tell me to log it, and they'd look at it after the holiday. So I logged it. I filed a formal incident report in Condor, categorized as System Anomaly, Patrol Log, and described the situation factually. Then I went and did my actual patrol. The patrol was normal. Every floor was as expected. Every door was locked. I scanned every checkpoint, and as I did, I watched the Condor log on my phone. The system had a mobile interface to confirm that each scan registered correctly. They did. My real scans appeared alongside the phantom ones, which meant the log now showed 2 complete patrols of my section between 11:15 p.m. and 1 a.m., one that I'd done and one that I hadn't. When I got back to the security office, I checked the log again. The phantom entries were gone. I scrolled up and down. I searched by timestamp, by guard ID, by checkpoint designation. Gone. The entries I'd seen at midnight, 40 checkpoint scans attributed to my badge, had been removed from the system. Only my real patrol remained in the log, clean and complete, as though the phantom entries had never existed. My incident report was still there. I opened it. The status had been changed to resolved. In the resolution notes, someone, or something, because the field that should have shown the name of the person who'd updated it was blank, had written, "Duplicate entries generated by system sync error. Entries purged. No action required." I stared at the blank name field for a long time. Then I closed the report and sat in the quiet of the security office and listened to the building breathe. Christmas passed. New Year's passed. January began. I continued working my shifts. I continued doing my patrols. I continued keeping my notebook. The phantom entries didn't recur, or if they did, they were generated and removed between my log checks, which I couldn't rule out. The camera feeds occasionally showed unfamiliar hallways as before. The elevator behaved normally. The building was the same building. But I wasn't quite the same guard. I'd developed a habit of second-guessing my own observations. When I walked a floor, I'd catch myself wondering whether I'd actually walked it or whether I was remembering a previous night's patrol and confusing it with the current one. The floors were so identical, the routine so consistent, that it was genuinely difficult sometimes to distinguish one night from another. Had I checked the 26th floor already tonight, or was I remembering last night? I'd check my log to confirm, and the log would show whatever it showed, and I'd accept it because I had to accept something. But the act of relying on the log to tell me what I'd done rather than relying on my own memory, felt like a small concession, a small surrender of authority over my own experience. In mid-January, I found something in my notebook that I didn't remember writing. It was on a page between two dated entries, January 11th and January 13th, and it was in my handwriting, though the pen pressure was heavier than my usual style, as though I'd been pressing hard. It said, 77C, 77D, 77E, 77F complete, all secure. I looked at it for a long time. The handwriting was mine. The notebook had been in my pocket throughout my shift, as always. I had no memory of writing those words. I had no memory of visiting any checkpoints on floor 77. I had no memory of anything happening on January 12th, which was the date that fell between the two surrounding entries, and which was apparently when I'd written this note. I checked the Condor log for January 12th. My shift log was normal, patrol entries at the expected times, all within my assigned floors. No phantom entries, no references to floor 77, everything clean. The system said I'd had a normal night. My notebook said I'd been to floor 77 and checked 4 checkpoints there. One of them was lying. Either the system had failed to record something that had happened, or I had written something in my notebook that hadn't happened. I couldn't determine which. I couldn't even determine which possibility frightened me more, that I'd been somewhere I couldn't remember, or that I'd written a false record without being aware of it. I made the doctor's appointment. I went on a Friday afternoon to a general practitioner in Koreatown who my insurance covered. I told her I was working night shifts and had experienced some episodes of lost time and possible memory gaps. She asked the standard questions: stress, sleep, diet, substances, family history. I answered honestly. She ordered blood work and an EEG, which she said would check for seizure activity. The blood work came back normal. The EEG was clean. She said that shift work sleep disorder could cause cognitive effects, including memory lapses, and recommended that I improve my sleep hygiene during the day. Blackout curtains, consistent wake time, melatonin if needed. She didn't seem alarmed. I didn't tell her about the building or floor 77 or the phantom log entries because those weren't medical concerns. Those were workplace issues. I bought the blackout curtains. I adjusted my sleep schedule. I continued working. February was quiet. The building was steady. The logs were clean. My patrols were uneventful. I stopped seeing unfamiliar camera feeds, or at least I stopped noticing them. My notebook entries were routine. Dates, times, no irregularities. I began to think that whatever had been happening in the fall and early winter had been a combination of system errors and my own adjustment to the demands of overnight work. The brain does strange things when you reverse your sleep cycle. Perception shifts. Memory becomes less reliable. It was all explicable. I was fine. On February 27th, I was in the elevator heading up for my midnight patrol. I scanned my badge, pressed 40, and the elevator rose. I was watching the floor indicator out of habit. I always watched it now, ever since the skipping incident months ago. It counted upward normally. 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40. The elevator slowed. The doors didn't open. I waited. Sometimes there was a lag between the indicator showing the floor number and the doors actually opening. A second or two, nothing unusual. I waited 5 seconds. 10. The doors stayed closed. I pressed the door open button. Nothing. I pressed 40 again. Nothing. The indicator still showed 40. Then it changed. It showed 41. I hadn't felt the elevator move. There'd been no acceleration, no shift in weight, no mechanical sound. But the indicator now said 41, then 42, 43. The numbers were climbing, silently, smoothly, without any physical sensation of movement. 48, 53, 60. I pressed the lobby button. I pressed every button. I pressed the emergency stop. Nothing responded. The indicator kept climbing. 65, 70, 72, 74, 75, 76, 77. The elevator stopped. I felt it stop. The slight deceleration, the settling. The indicator showed 77. The doors opened. I was looking at a hallway. It was carpeted in dark charcoal, almost black. The lighting was warm, amber-toned, coming from the ceiling fixtures. The corridor extended straight ahead, longer than any floor I'd patrolled, long enough that the far end was a soft blur. The doors along each side were closed, evenly spaced, identical to the doors on every other floor, except that their handles were a darker metal, more bronze than silver. The air was still. Not stale. It didn't smell like an unused space. It smelled clean, climate-controlled, occupied. But there was no sound. No HVAC hum, no building noise, nothing. I stood in the elevator with the doors open, and I looked at floor 77. It was real. It was a real floor, with real carpet, and real doors, and real lighting. It was not a hallucination, not a visual distortion, not a dream. I was awake and alert, and standing in an elevator that had brought me to a floor I'd been told to ignore, and the floor was there. I didn't step out, not yet. I stood in the elevator and I studied what I could see. The hallway looked maintained. The carpet was clean. The lighting was functional. The doors were in good condition. There was no dust, no signs of disuse. Someone was taking care of this floor. It was being cleaned and lit and climate-controlled, just like every other floor in the building. I looked at the elevator panel. The button for 77 was lit, which it had never been before when I'd pressed it. I pressed the lobby button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. The elevator didn't respond. I pressed door close. The doors stayed open. The elevator was holding me at 77 with the doors open, as though it was waiting for something. I stepped out. The carpet was soft under my shoes. The air was the same temperature as the rest of the building, but it felt different in a way I couldn't articulate. Not warmer or cooler, not wetter or drier, just different. Like the air in a room where something has recently changed, but you can't identify what. I took a few steps down the hallway. My footsteps were silent on the carpet. I could hear myself breathing. I walked to the first door on the right and tried the handle. Locked. I tried the first door on the left. Locked. I walked further. All locked. The hallway continued, door after door, perfectly even, the perspective narrowing ahead of me. I passed what should have been the full length of a standard floor, but the hallway continued. I looked behind me. The elevator was still there, doors still open, light from the cab spilling into the corridor. It seemed farther away than it should have been, given how far I thought I'd walked. On the wall to my right, I saw a badge scanner, a patrol checkpoint, identical to the ones on every other floor. It had a small label beneath it. 77A. I looked at it. I thought about the phantom log entries. 77A at 2:47 a.m. on a night when I'd been sitting at my desk. 77B at 3:08 a.m. The note in my notebook. 77C, 77D, 77E, 77F, complete, all secure. Checkpoints I'd apparently scanned on a night I didn't remember. I took my badge from my belt and held it near the scanner. The scanner beeped. A green light flashed. The checkpoint registered. I continued down the hallway. 77B was 20 meters ahead, on the left wall. I scanned it. Green light. Further on, 77C, then 77D, 77E, 77F. 6 checkpoints, evenly spaced along a corridor that was longer than any floor in the building should have been. At the end of the corridor, past 77F, there was a window. I walked to it and looked out. I could see downtown Los Angeles, the buildings, the lights, the distant grid of streets. The view was from a high floor, higher than 40 where I usually was, and the city looked smaller, more distant. I pressed my hand against the glass. It was cold. The glass was real. The city was real. I was high in a building that was real, on a floor that wasn't supposed to exist, but was solid and present and cold against my palm. I turned around and walked back down the corridor toward the elevator. It was a long walk, longer than it should have been. I passed the checkpoints in reverse order. When I reached the elevator, I stepped inside. The doors closed immediately. The indicator showed 77 for a moment. Then the elevator began to descend. I didn't press any buttons. It descended on its own, smoothly, and stopped at 2. The doors opened onto the familiar hallway outside the security office. I stepped out. I went into the security office and sat down. The monitors showed their normal feeds. The building was quiet. I looked at the clock on the wall. 12:16 a.m. I had left for my patrol at 12 a.m. I had been gone 16 minutes. In that time, according to my experience, I had ridden the elevator to floor 77, walked a corridor that felt at least a quarter-mile long, scanned 6 checkpoints, looked out a window, and returned. 16 minutes didn't seem like enough time for all of that, but it also didn't seem impossibly short. I couldn't say for certain. I pulled up the Condor log. There were 6 new entries. Checkpoint 77A through 77F. Timestamped between 12:04 and 12:12 a.m. Guard ID 4187. This time they were real. I had been there. I had scanned them. The system had recorded what I'd actually done. I looked at the entries for a long time. Then I continued my patrol. Floors 15 through 40 as usual, as though nothing had happened. Everything was normal. Every door locked, every checkpoint scanned, every hallway the same as it always was. When I got back to the security office, I opened the Condor log to review my full shift activity. The 6 entries for floor 77 were gone. In their place, at 12:04 through 12:12, there were checkpoint entries for floors 40 through 37. A partial patrol of my normal section, attributed to my badge. At the time I'd been on 77. The system had overwritten my real activity with a fabricated one. Or, and this was the thought that I couldn't quite hold in my head without it slipping away, it had always shown that, and my memory of seeing the 77 entries was itself wrong. I opened my notebook. I hadn't written anything down yet. I picked up my pen and started to write about what had happened on floor 77. The hallway, the carpet, the checkpoints, the window. I wrote 2 sentences and then stopped because I was looking at the page and there was already writing on it. Below my 2 sentences, in my handwriting, with my pen, it said, "Patrol complete. All floors nominal. No irregularities." I hadn't written that. I was certain I hadn't written it. I had written 2 sentences about floor 77, and then I'd stopped, and the words below were not mine, except they were in my handwriting, and they were in my notebook, and the ink was the same. I closed the notebook. I finished my shift. I handed off to the day guard. I drove home. I slept, or I think I slept. I came back the next night and did it all again. Cameras, patrols, logs, no irregularities, no phantom entries, no unfamiliar camera feeds. A clean, quiet, normal night. And the night after that, and the one after that. I'm still working at Meridian Tower. It's been several months now since the night I visited floor 77, or since I believe I visited floor 77, or since the building's records indicate that I conducted a standard patrol on floors 15 through 40, and nothing unusual occurred. All 3 of those statements may be equally true. I've stopped trying to determine which one is the most accurate, because accuracy seems to depend on which system you trust. Your own memory, or the one that's been recording your movements since before you started paying attention. My notebook is full of entries I recognize, and a few I don't. The ones I don't recognize are always mundane, always professional, always correct. They describe patrols I don't remember taking on floors I'm not sure I've visited, and they always conclude with the same assessment. All secure. No irregularities. The handwriting is mine. The observations are thorough and precise. Whoever is writing them, whether it's me in a state I can't recall or something else entirely, is doing a very good job. The Condor system shows a clean record. My performance reviews are positive. Gil told me last month that I was one of the most reliable guards they'd had in years. He said the overnight logs during my shifts were consistently complete and well documented. He said he'd noticed that I was even logging patrol activity on restricted floors, which apparently no previous guard had done, and that building management appreciated the thoroughness. I didn't ask him what he meant by that. I didn't ask which restricted floors. I didn't ask how long I'd been logging patrols on floors that weren't part of my route, or what the logs said, or whether the entries matched my actual movements. I just said thank you, and that I was glad to be contributing. At night, when I sit in the security office and watch the monitors, I sometimes see a figure walking a corridor on one of the upper floors. The camera feed is labeled in the standard format: a floor number, a position, a camera number. The floor number is always one I don't recognize. The figure is always walking away from the camera, moving at a steady, unhurried pace, checking doors. The figure is wearing a dark uniform. The figure moves the way I move, the same gait, the same slight rightward lean I have from the years of warehouse work. I watch the figure until the feed rotates to the next camera, and then it's gone, and the hallway is empty, and I go back to my logs and write down that nothing happened, because nothing did. Nothing is happening. The building is quiet. The building is secure. The systems are functioning normally. The guard is on duty, and the guard is doing his job, and the records confirm this, and there is nothing that can't be explained by a minor system error, a timestamp discrepancy, a trick of light on a monitor in a small room on the second floor of a building in a city that looks from the 77th floor like something very far away. I had a dream last week, or I think it was a dream. I was standing at the window at the end of a long corridor, looking out at the city, and the city was dark. Not nighttime dark, all of it was dark. No lights in any building, no headlights, no streetlights, just the shapes of buildings against a sky that was not quite black, but was the color of the carpet under my feet. And I was holding my badge up to the glass, and the glass was beeping, and a green light was flashing, and I understood that I was scanning a checkpoint, that the window was a checkpoint, that everything was a checkpoint, and that my job was to scan them all and confirm that the building was secure, and that the city was secure, and that the dark was secure. And I said aloud, to no one, to the system, all clear. And the beeping stopped, and I woke up in the security office with my badge in my hand, and the monitors cycling through their feeds, and no memory of having fallen asleep. The log for that night is complete. Every checkpoint scanned, every floor accounted for. The timestamps are consistent. The record is flawless. I don't check floor 77 anymore, or rather, I don't decide to check floor 77. Whether I check it or not is a question the logs can answer better than I can, and the logs say what they've always said, that the building is secure, that the guard is on duty, and that everything is functioning as intended. I'm starting to think they might be right.